Tessa Clarke with us, who is the co-founder and CEO of OLIO, with us this morning. Thank you, Tessa, for joining us.
Hi.
OLIO is a neighbour-to-neighbour food sharing app, which is tackling the problem of household food waste at scale. It's grown to over 2 million users in just over 4 years, and its impact has been widely recognised, most notably by the United Nations, who highlighted OLIO as a beacon for the world, and by Vivatech, who have awarded OLIO the next European unicorn. Tessa is passionate about the sharing economy as a solution for a sustainable world, and about profit with a purpose as the next business paradigm. So Tessa, yeah, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Hi, great to be with you.
So while Tessa and I talk about this, I encourage you to put any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll come on to that later on in the conversation, but if there's anything that sparks an idea or a question that Tessa says, please do put that as a question in the Q&A box, and we'll come on to that later. So Tessa, just to begin, could you tell us about OLIO and how it started?
So OLIO started just over 5 years ago through a personal experience that I had. I was living in Switzerland for work and moving back to the UK. And on moving day, the removal men said to me that I had to throw away all of our uneaten food. Now, I'm a farmer's daughter, so my parents are farming up in the northeast of England, and I had a childhood that was characterized just by an enormous amount of hard work, quite frankly. And so through that upbringing, I absolutely hate food waste because I know how much energy and effort goes into it. And so I wasn't prepared to throw away the food as the removal men were asking me to do. And so much to their irritation, I stopped packing and instead set out onto the streets to try and find someone to give my food to. And to cut a long story short, the person I was hoping to be able to give it to wasn't there that day. And I wasn't to be defeated. So I went back to my apartment, and when the packing men weren't looking, I put the non-perishable food in the very bottom, sort of hid it in the very bottom of my packing boxes. And at that moment in time, I just thought, this is crazy that I'm having to go to this sort of these lengths smuggling this food, when surely there is someone within 100 meters of me who would like it. The problem is they just don't know it exists. And I spent 10, 15 years at that point in time working in the world of digital. I knew there was an app for absolutely everything. And I couldn't believe that there wasn't an app where I could just advertise that I had some food available.
Mm-hmm. So then tell us about how you actually went on to co-found the app and the story there, and what it's for, what it does.
Yeah. So the very first thing after I'd had that idea was I told a few people about it, and they all thought that I was absolutely crazy. I was on maternity leave at the time, so I think they thought that baby brain had gotten the better of me and I should probably get back to work, because an app that connects strangers to share food was obviously a terrible idea. And I did, though, happen to tell my now co-founder, Sasha, who thought it was a marvelous idea. And we together started researching the problem of food waste to see if it was a problem beyond my personal experience. And what we discovered absolutely horrified us. We couldn't believe what we were uncovering. And so very quickly, in a nutshell, we discovered that globally, 1/3 of all the food we produce each year gets thrown away, which is worth over $1 trillion. Alongside that widespread waste, we have widespread hunger. There are 800 million people who go to bed hungry every night. And even in a country like the UK, we have over 8 million people, which is equivalent to the population of London, who are living in food poverty. So we have widespread waste, we have widespread hunger. And then the real kicker is the environmental impact of food waste. So if it were to be a country, food waste would be the 3rd largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after the USA and China. And the reason for that is the fact that a landmass larger than China is used every year to grow food that's never eaten. So that is land that has been deforested, soil that has been degraded, species driven into extinction, indigenous populations displaced. 1/4 of humanity's fresh water is used to grow food that is never eaten. So you have all those resources going into the production of food. It then goes through an incredibly long supply chain. And then when food decomposes without access to oxygen, which is generally what it does, most of it is thrown away and ends up in landfill, then it creates methane, which is 25 times more deadly than CO2. So you take all of those factors, and that is why food waste, if it were to be a country, would be the 3rd largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, food waste alone, the emissions from food waste are 4 to 5 times greater than the emissions from the whole aviation industry. That's just the food we waste. So we kind of were pretty horrified to discover that this is our reality. And then we were really, really shocked to find out that in a country such as the UK, half of all food waste takes place in the home. I think, like most people, we had assumed that surely the majority of food waste takes place at a store level, at a local supermarket, but actually that couldn't be further from the truth. And the reason for that is that we have about 28 million households in the UK throwing away a quarter of the weekly shop, collectively adds up to £14 billion. And we have 10 or 15,000 stores throwing away half a percentage point. So that's why retailers are less than 5% of the food waste, retail stores, and we in our homes are half. And so OLIO exists to solve that half of that problem I've just described to you, and it does it in a really simple way. Anyone who has food they don't want or need snaps a photo and adds it to the app. The neighbours get an alert letting them know something new has been added near them. And then they can request what they want and then pop round and pick it up. So the real magic is two neighbours meeting in real life to share food.
Amazing. So you've talked a bit about kind of the response you had from your friends and your co-founder when you talked about what you wanted to do and eliminate food waste. Can you tell us a bit about how the app took off in terms of investment? You've had a combination of venture capital and impact investing. So can you just tell us a bit more about that and what that meant to the app actually taking off?
So investment has been absolutely critical for OLIO to get to where we are today, because the reality of our model is it's something that's always going to have to work at scale. You can't really monetize 10 people sort of sharing food in one local community. So from the very earliest of days, we knew that we would have to get investment. We've now raised 4 rounds of investment, which, as you say, has been a combination from classic and Silicon Valley style VCs and also impact investors. The first round of financing we raised was the best one ever. I wish I could replicate it. I went and asked for advice and got investment. Ever since then, it has been a brutal, hard slog. And I think sort of, for a variety of reasons, tech for good is obviously a newly sort of emergent space. The fact that we're very early in our monetization journey, the fact that we're 2 female co-founders, 1% of all venture capital investment goes to female founded businesses, 89% to male founded businesses, and the delta to mixed teams. So we've certainly been kind of going up against a very tough fundraising environment. But and for a long time, we weren't sure whether we needed to sort of choose, back one pony, so to speak, i.e. should we be going just after VC money or should we be going after impact investors? And we've decided that the right approach for us is a mix of both. So the VCs have the scale and the ambition and the experience of working with founders that have quickly grown their businesses internationally. But they perhaps don't share our kind of necessarily share our kind of burning mission in the same way that impact investors do. But unfortunately, impact investors don't have as much capital, and we found they're often a lot more risk averse. And so we found that actually kind of having a blend of the 2 types of investors has been really effective for us. And yeah, we've sort of raised 4 times.
Wow, I'm just interested on the female founder point. Why do you think it is that only 1% of investment goes to female founders? Is it because there aren't actually that many female founded businesses? But surely that's not the case anymore.
No, the far bigger problem from my vantage point is the fact that we have very little diversification at the level of the gatekeepers of capital. So quite frankly, there are not enough women or people from diverse backgrounds who are on ICs, who are in check writing positions. And how I figured this out was through looking at my own track record and saying, well, what is my conversion rate when I'm pitching to women? And my conversion rate when pitching to women is north of 75%, i.e. ends in an investment. And my conversion rate of pitching to men is probably around about 5 or 10%. The challenge is that there's only a tiny handful of women who have genuine check writing capabilities. And I definitely believe that is a big part of why it's so challenging for female founders, for diverse founders to get capital. Now, why is that? I think a big part of it is because to be an excellent investor, you obviously have to invest in what you're passionate about. And often you're passionate about things that are solving problems that you can relate to. And sort of food waste in the home, more often than not, is not a problem. that a white male VC can relate to directly, because generally someone else is taking care of that problem for him. So yeah, so we would dearly love to see much more diversity amongst the venture capital community, because I think for far too long, problems for the 1% have got handsomely funded, and the problems that are affecting the 99% have received woefully little. And I think it's time for the VC community to show a far more imagination, far more boldness, far more ambition, and to kind of get out and start backing businesses that are solving real urgent problems like the climate crisis, like social inequality, like access to education and healthcare and stuff like that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Just a quick reminder to everyone listening, if you've joined us a bit later, please do be adding your questions into the Q&A box. We're hearing some a really interesting story about how we can be more sustainable with our food waste. So please do, if you have any questions for Tessa, please do add them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll come on to that later. But Tessa, just to come on to the app itself and actually the people using it, you have over 2 million users, or at least that was the number last time I checked. I don't know if it's grown since then. Have you noticed any change in how it's being used at the moment during lockdown? How has lockdown changed what you're seeing and actually how your business works?
So lockdown has had a really, really interesting impact. So when lockdown was first announced, it wasn't at all clear that a neighbor-to-neighbor food sharing app could continue to exist, because our model depended upon people kind of meeting in real life. We very quickly shifted the model to make sure that all pickups are no contact. So the person who was giving the item away would just pop it outside their house just before the other person arrived. And that sort of worked very well. But we did see a decline in the first sort of week or two of lockdown, I think, as everybody was just trying to figure out what on earth was going on. And then, as we heard more and more news coming out, for example, that 1.5 million Brits were going hungry every single day, as we saw bare supermarket shelves, as we had growing concern for our frontline workers, since then we've actually seen a dramatic increase in neighbor-to-neighbor sharing. So the food sharing has increased by 30%. The non-food sharing has increased by just under 200%. And I think very much that has been in response to the fact that a lot of people are in lockdown, they're in quarantine, they're sort of wondering, what can I do to help? Because you can feel a bit kind of powerless, stuck in your home. What can I do to help others? I know that there are people in my local community who might want or need what I've got. And actually, OLIO is a really safe and easy, convenient way for them to access it that doesn't require them kind of going into busy shops or anything like that. And we also, when the school closures were announced, on the Wednesday evening, the next morning, Thursday morning, I was preparing breakfast for my kids, and we were talking about the fact they weren't going to have to go to school on Monday. And very quickly in that conversation, they asked me, but what about the kids who need the school meals? Because that's something that we had spoken about before. And that triggered in me a thought of, gosh, yeah, good question. What about those kids? And so 24 hours later, we launched our Cook for Kids campaign. And we managed to get just over 20 sort of celebrity chefs on board, getting them sort of cooking for kids, but also providing recipes that our community could follow along to. And we really wanted to sort of galvanize our community and actually get that community spirit going and get people cooking for their neighboring families. We extended it to cook for carers as well. And that's just been a really, really successful campaign in terms of getting people giving back and connecting with their local community.
That's amazing. I mean, it's so good to hear those stories of community, isn't it, during this time? I think we're seeing a lot of those at the moment. So in response to that campaign that you set up, what's the take up been like? What have you been seeing?
So we sort of had no idea whether it would or wouldn't work or not, but we very quickly realized that, wow, we've kind of hit on a nerve in the most positive sense here, because I think for a long time, community has been overlooked as something that's just incredibly powerful and emotional and fulfilling. I think too often we kind of look to the individual, or we look to government, or we look to charity, and we've forgotten about that sort of that fourth pillar, which is the community. And so we have been absolutely stunned just by the sheer volume. Tens of thousands of meals have been shared in that way. And then we've also been incredibly impressed. We have our Food Waste Heroes program. So they are people who volunteer, who pick up unsold food at the end of the day from local stores that are near them. And then they take that food home, they add it to the app, their neighbors request it, and the neighbors pop around and pick it up. And so that essentially enables a supermarket or cafe or deli to be zero food waste. And we've also seen a massive rise in the volumes of food that our volunteers have been redistributing. And actually the volume of food doubled sort of during the last 30 days, because we've had so many businesses that have got food kind of stuck in the supply chain, and we've got so many volunteers who are just leaping into action to make sure that that food is rescued and eaten rather than thrown away. So we hope that, you know, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it's been an accelerant of two things that we think were sort of happening before, but are now become more prominent. One is community, and then the other thing is research was released, not by us, but by an organization called Hubbub, which showed that over half of people now say that they are valuing food more, and that they are also wasting food less. And you know, that is something that years and years and years of sort of public education has failed to achieve. But sort of a couple of months during the pandemic has reinforced for people just how important food is, and just how important it is that everybody has access to it and it doesn't get thrown away.
Yeah, that's mad that it's taken a pandemic to create that change, isn't it? Coming on to the ideas around sustainability and actually what your end goal is. Purpose and profit is such a phrase now at the moment for sustainable business. It's kind of the balance that businesses are trying to achieve. What does that mean to you, that purpose and profit phrase?
Well, to me, it's just common sense. And it sort of drives me crazy that we're even sitting here debating this, quite frankly. I genuinely believe, you know, my children, by the time they're sort of in the workforce, that we will look back and just say that they will be stunned that there was any debate whatsoever that this is what business should do, and that business should be fully accountable for all of the externalities of their business model. It's very clear that business needs to operate to benefit society and employees and the environment and stuff like that, and not destroy them. And so whilst in the short term that's perhaps seen as a slightly strange way of thinking, I'm absolutely convinced that in the medium to long term, any business that does not operate with a profit with purpose model will lose its license to exist. I just don't think those businesses, I just don't think customers will allow them to continue in the world. So I think we're going through this very awkward and uncomfortable kind of transition period where a lot of the incumbents and the status quo is all about reinforcing profit without purpose. But there's this whole new sort of cohort of disruptors, if you like, who are absolutely convinced that this is the new model, the new paradigm, and lots and lots of people think the same way. And so I think we'll see a big generational transfer of our kind of operating model.
Do you think it is about generational differences? I mean, with those big incumbents, what is the mindset shift that needs to happen in order to make that change and make that transition? Is it just driving from the consumer, or what is there something more kind of profound?
I think it's partly generational, but don't get me wrong, there are plenty of people in positions of power who believe the same, but unfortunately they're kind of a few lone voices. It's very, very hard to change the status quo. But what is helping to drive that change is the fact that Mother Nature, for want of a better word, is showing us that our operating models are unsustainable. Also, the level of inequality that we have in society is rearing its head and making it impossible to sort of brush that under the carpet anymore. And so I think there's just lots more data and case studies and evidence showing that the current model of capitalism is pretty broken. And I think that, combined with the energies and enthusiasm and fresh thinking of younger generations, partnering with some of the people who've got lots and lots of experience, is hopefully going to make the change happen that we all need to see. And I think it's unavoidable. Like, I think we're just, it's not an if, it's just a matter of when.
In terms of the consumer mind shift as well, because I think there are two that need to happen, aren't there? And I think the power of the consumer can't be underestimated, because actually that is often what's driving businesses, isn't it? So what needs to happen there as well? Is it just that people need to be more aware of what's happening, more aware of the problem, or take more responsibility? Like what needs to happen?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of debate. Let's just take, say, the climate crisis as an example. There is a lot of debate around the power of the individual and what needs to change. Is it individual behavior change, or is it systemic change? Clearly, the answer is we need both. But I often see a lot of people undermining the power of the individual, and I find that quite frustrating, because, a very powerful statistic, 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions come as a result of household consumption. So please do not tell me that as individuals and as consumers, we aren't powerful. We are incredibly powerful. Now, it's very difficult, given the system that we operate in, to consume in a way that is sustainable. But what I see happening is that a small but rapidly growing cohort of consumers are voting with their wallets. They recognize that every pound is a vote, and they are taking it away from unsustainable, dirty businesses, and they are giving it to new businesses. And that is incredibly powerful, because that sends a data point up to the incumbents, and they see that data, they see those changes in their sales numbers very, very quickly. And that's then when real systemic change happens, when you see the large incumbents recognizing, gosh, we need to provide more plant-based foods, for example, or we need to move away from this kind of fast approach to fashion. It really is as a result of individuals who are voting with their wallets, driving a signal up, and that is then what drives systemic change. And I also think we mustn't forget our power as voters as well, because ultimately government and regulation is going to play an enormously important role in creating the future that we all want and need. And we have incredible power there through our ability to vote at the ballot box.
Coming on to think about the sharing economy as well. That's another thing that we've seen develop over the last few years. Obviously, at the moment, it's become quite prominent, with people being furloughed and needing to work multiple jobs and kind of participating in the sharing economy more. How do you think the sharing economy can help drive more sustainable business, and is it already doing that?
So I get quite frustrated by the phrase sharing economy being used to describe businesses such as Uber and Airbnb and Deliveroo and people like that, because that's not the sharing economy in my view. That is micro capitalism. It is me sort of renting out my bedroom or driving. Really is about micro capitalism, and I do think there is a new wave of businesses which are much more aligned with the true concept of sharing, of which OLIO might be one, trusted house sitters, for example, might be another. But I do, it's kind of, I guess, beyond my remit to comment too much on the likes of Uber and Airbnb, etc. But it is very clear to me that people need to be treated as people and not as resources. And I think those businesses have thrived thus far through treating people as resources, but I don't think that's going to be a sustainable business model in the long run. And I think there will be a period of reckoning that they're kind of starting to go through now.
Well, thank you, Tessa. I think we've had a lot to think about there. We'll move on to some of the questions that are coming in now. So if you do have any questions, anyone listening, please do put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We've had a couple come in already, which is great, but please do keep sending them in. We'll try and get through as many as we can. So Tessa, our first question here is looking at the Business Roundtable from last year. So I'll just read it out. It says, last July, 180 US CEOs belonging to the Business Roundtable put forward a new statement on the purpose of business being to serve the interests of multiple stakeholders. And yet they left out the environment from their statement. In your view, are they really serious? Do they really get it?
In a simple word, no. I think one of the other things that this pandemic has shown us is what serious really looks like. So problems that have been unsolvable for decades, let's say rough sleeping, for example, has miraculously been kind of solved within a space of a week, and lots of problems and challenges have been solved very, very quickly because those in power have recognized that we are operating truly in a crisis. I do not believe that anyone in power right now is operating as if the climate crisis is really a crisis. And I think the fact that the environment was left out of that is a reflection of that. But I also am a pragmatist and recognize that Rome wasn't built in a day, and change often does have to be a kind of a sequential process. And so I do think that we need to celebrate every step that is taken on the one hand, whilst pushing for more with the other.
Thank you for that. We have another question here from Ben Diaz. Thank you, Ben. He is asking, what was your communication strategy in getting your app users and investors to buy into this, which is an amazing idea, but requires such significant shift in behaviour against the norm?
So our communication strategy, I think, was fairly straightforward in terms of putting our mission front and central of everything that we do. And I think that's the right approach for the early adopters, because that is something that excites them, energizes them, engages them, and also then empowers them to kind of take your message forward. As we start transitioning from the early adopters to the early mainstream, I think you start changing your, the mission is still absolutely critical, but perhaps the messaging starts to evolve a little bit more to focus on things such as community or convenience and stuff like that. In terms of the route to market for our messaging, sort of pre-launch, Sasha and I, and actually in the very, very early stages, we did an enormous amount of stuff that doesn't scale. So before we even launched the app, we had managed to get over 2,000 people signed up to find out about when OLIO was going to be released. They all lived in Crouch End, and so that involved us spending days on street corners, handing out free food and encouraging people to sign up. And then another core part of our communication strategy has been our ambassador program. And so we have had over 50,000 people now reach out to offer to help spread the word about OLIO in their local community. And we have empowered those people by giving them, they can either go on a digital path or they can order hyperlocal kind of guerrilla marketing materials from us. So posters, letters, flyers. We give them presentations to speak at community events, templates for reaching out to their local press. And that model of empowering passionate people to spread the word on our behalf has been a really powerful one.
And another similar question we have here. What is the hardest thing about changing consumer behaviour?
It is unimaginably hard. And so the hardest thing is the emotional toll, I think, that it takes on you as a founder, because you can see this world, you know that we have to get to that world. And then just what's incredibly stressful is just figuring out, can we get there quickly enough for the environment, for all the people that benefit from OLIO, and before our money runs out. And driving behavior change is phenomenally hard. What's also incredibly infuriating about it is, I think I've sort of taken a bit of a mini PhD in social psychology and behavioral change. And one of the biggest determinants of whether people will change their behavior or not is the belief that other people are doing it. And so you're then sort of caught in a bit of this kind of chicken egg situation where you need to try and persuade people that actually everybody else is doing this thing. So it's really, really, really hard. I actually think that behavioral change is the hardest thing of all. And I certainly think, say, whole industries are going to have to arise to help us achieve this. So the advertising industry, for example, at the moment is busy just flogging people crap that they don't need, quite frankly, which isn't actually that hard. And what that whole industry needs to evolve to do is to actually persuade us to change our behaviors. And that's really, really hard.
We have a question here about what will happen after COVID-19, after lockdown. So it says, for many commentators, the fact that the world economy and society will need to be somewhat rebuilt after COVID means that it gives us the chance to change things about the system, for example, carbon emissions. How can businesses be proactively driving this now?
So we have this unique moment in time where the status quo has just been thrown up into the air / switched off. And it's amazing, because I think when you're trying to drive consumer change, behavior change, business change, government change in the status quo, it's like wading through sticky treacle. Whereas now we've all actually been given permission to completely rethink everything. And my greatest hope is that we will rebuild the future that we all need and the future that we all want. And it really shouldn't be beyond us to do that. My greatest fear is that sort of inertia and fear and just sort of defaulting to the known will be a stronger force, and that we won't be as bold and as ambitious as we should be. In terms of what can businesses do, I think there have been so many people who, perhaps trapped in their own little worlds, are desperate for change, but they have never really been able to be connected up, and have never been given permission to dare talk about these things or dream about the world that they want. And those people include your customers, and they include your employees. And so if I were a business, I would be really actively engaging your customers and employees and saying, well, what future do we want to build, and initiating that conversation now, and then cracking on and building it.
Cool. One final question, I think, before we wrap up, and you've already touched on this, but this question asks, what could be the silver lining out of COVID-19?
I think the silver lining is the fact that it has given us all an opportunity to pause, and to reflect. I think we've sort of collectively been like a hamster on a wheel, just spinning round, and we haven't taken that time out. And through pausing, we've recognized things such as the power of community. We're actively thinking about what is the world that we want to rebuild. We have realized that humanity is the most valuable thing that we have, and it's something to be cherished and built upon, not sort of trampled down. So, and I think the other thing that has been a silver lining, in the most unpleasant of ways, is the fact that there has been a mass awakening to the horrific inequality that we have in our societies. It is absolutely unconscionable that in a country such as the UK, or indeed anywhere, but that we have 1.5 million people who are hungry every single day. And for far too, and sadly, actually, that isn't a new fact. But as a result of COVID, we are now at least talking about it. And so I think there has been a great awakening in those who have power and privilege as to just how unequal our society has become. And I am hopeful that they will then have resolve to, sounds cheesy, but to build a better world.
Cool. Thank you, Tessa, and thank you so much for joining us, and for sharing that. I think you've sparked a lot of thought this morning. First thing in the morning after a bank holiday. So thank you for that, and thank you so much for joining us.
No worries.
I will hand back to Emma now to close. But thank you, everyone who's joined us this morning. Over to you, Emma.
Tessa, thank you. That was invaluable. I think the statistics you gave us at the beginning were horrific, and I think leaves a lot of time for us to think about how we can all help and how we can all support. So thank you, and how we can all improve in our own lives, in our own homes. So I do hope people can take note and really lead by example on this. So thank you, Tessa, very, very much for setting us off in terms of that next pivot story, a really critical one. And Shama, thank you very much indeed.